Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith. And we are going to continue our discussion about metaphysics. And today what we want to discuss is purpose in being. Last week we had spoke about authentic being, and particularly the area of study of in philosophy of metaphysics and how that studies being. And two things that we kind of drew from the reality of the being is that in it are meaning and purpose. And we spoke last time a little bit about meaning, and today what we want to do is talk about purpose in being. So Dr. Smith, maybe you can give us a quick recap of when we talk about being itself, of course metaphysics being the study of that being, but also, how do we find meaning and purpose in this being?
So, thank you, Jason. One of the main tasks in philosophy, and then especially in metaphysics, is to come to an understanding of what things are.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That is to discover the definition of things, and that's rooted really in understanding the essence of things. So, last time we talked a good bit about the idea of meaning, right? And so when you think about meaning, just think definition, right?
Right.
Can you define things? And uh, in a classical perspective, we can define things, and many of the most important definitions are based really on reality, right? That is, that we can define, say, for example, Homo sapien or man as a rational animal. That's not a made up definition. That's a discovery,
Right.
right? That's a discovery of a meaning that's already embedded within human reality. And so that's very important, right? That is that the definitions of things, the meaning of things, that we can define things, and that those definitions are set really not by us in the most important cases, but really by reality itself,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that there's a sense in which the definitions of things are independent from human caprice, human will, and human mind. Of course, it takes a well ordered human mind to bring those definitions to light, but those definitions aren't ultimately subject to or subordinate to the human mind. In philosophy, that's called realism, right? That is, you have the view, right, that there are definitions, that there are meanings, that there are real essences
Mm-hmm.
that are outside of the mind. The opposite of realism in philosophy is idealism, the view that all definition, all meaning is subordinate to the human mind. So that's what we talked about last time. Obviously, I would say that's very important. You start to think about things like justice, marriage, friendship, sexuality, all those sorts of issues, right? Clearly, it's very important, right? That
Right.
definitions go beyond, sort of the human ideas. Rather, our ideas need to be based on and can be based on reality.
Yeah, and one of the other points that we made is that when something exists, it exists as something, which means it has
Right.
those distinguishing characteristics. Like you said, it's
Hmm.
something that we discover. It's not something that we ourselves define in that absolute sense. But
Sure.
so we made that connection, of course, between existence and essence. That
Right.
when something exists, and we understand this, like things do not just kind of exist in a blob. When something exists and we say, oh, that's a chair. Well, there's distinguishing characteristics of a chair that have to do with the nature of the chair, and so
Mhm.
we understand this about so many things. Yet, in our modern culture, we like to say, well, we can define things however we want, and you
Right.
do and like those horrible. I mean, they're not even good on a bumper sticker. They're not even good bumper. So
You know what,
we
Jason? I'm sorry to get off track here, but
yeah.
I heard this terrible phrase the other day called adulting.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Well,
it's a like it's a verb. Like you can start adulting and then stop adulting.
yeah. Yeah. People today get tired of adulting, so they just need like, and that's what's led to the invention of these. You'll get a kick out of this. Look it up when we're done here.
Okay.
It's essentially like a pop up tent for an adult to take to their office, and they can have this little pop up tent so that they can take a break from adulting or whatever and just kind of sit in their tent and collect their thoughts.
You
Uh,
know, we really actually just need an invasion. Like in general, I'm against war. Like I want to try to have as few wars as possible.
yeah,
But
but
maybe we just need a good invasion. Just a good invasion to kind of. I mean, good grief, how pathetic, right?
oh
I
my
mean,
gosh, yeah, yeah, it's
our ancestors would mock us. I mean, they would just mock us.
oh yeah,
Uh,
not even that far. Just I mean, our grown adults mock us.
right. The idea that it's a verb that you can start doing and stop doing is absurd,
Yeah,
right? You either are an adult or you are not, right? Okay. And you never get to just sort of say, "Oh, well, I'm not adulting now. I did that for 2 hours a day. Check. Now I'm
yeah.
what? Now what? Now what are you? A child, right?"
That's
I
right.
mean, if so, then please don't vote, don't drive a car, don't own a house.
Yeah,
None of that
just
stuff. Right? Just
stay in the house. Stay in your little pop up tent.
so there's a failure to define, right? And to realize that, sorry, you don't ever get to take a break from being an adult. You just
That's right.
either are or you are not.
Maybe we should do a giveaway. We'll do a giveaway, maybe of one of those adult tents. People people can listen to our metaphysics lectures in their adult tent and realize what they're
Right?
doing is absurd.
You get a
But
little button put on, like you can pen on. You could, yeah, I adulted today.
which leads into what we're talking about today with finding purpose in being, and
Mm-hmm.
that along with meaning, so kind of, what a thing is, the nature of it, we can also find the purpose, or as
Sure.
philosophy says, natural ends.
Right.
So maybe, Dr. Smith, we could begin there by defining kind of what a natural end is,
Mm-hmm.
and how do we go about like understanding the natural end of things. How, because it seems to be, if it is discussed today, it's disputed that things have natural ends. So how is this
All right.
something that we can understand and grasp and help show others?
Sure. Yeah, this is a very controversial point, but it's closely connected to what we're talking about with respect to definition and meaning. And I think it's just really crucial in terms of dealing with the kind of, um, I don't know, chaotic and disordered culture in which we live. Um, so when I'm in class, the way I deal with this is to connect purpose and meaning in the question of the meaning of life.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a textbook, a place I was required to use for a number of semesters, where they had, like, the last chapter was the meaning of life, right? And so, being a good philosophy professor, I wrote on the board, what is the meaning of life, right? So what is the meaning of this question, right? And of course, that annoyed the students, but it actually sparked a good conversation. And one of the things that comes out of that is you come to recognize how closely meaning and purpose are connected. So
Yeah.
when people raise the question of the meaning of life, what does it all mean? What does my life mean? What is the meaning of my family, my romance, my whatever it may be? The purpose starts to creep in. And there's a good reason for that, which is that very often, I wouldn't necessarily say in every case, I mean, I don't want to be that sweeping, but at least very often, or most of the time, definition, that is meaning, comes to light when you understand purpose, right? So we can sort of define what something is when we know why it is,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it's raison d'etre, right? It's goal, it's telos, right? The purpose for which it exists. So I can give you a good example of this. I think it's just kind of a basic example is when you think about um, the question, what is it with respect to the heart, right? And I mean, literally the physical organ,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, well, if you kind of look in a lot of biology textbooks, at some point they'll say something like, well, the heart is a pump, right?
Yeah.
And we even use language like valves, right? And chambers,
Mm-hmm.
right? Things
Mm-hmm.
like that, right? Because the function of a heart, right? The purpose of a heart, right? Is to circulate blood through the body. And so once you comprehend the function or purpose that distinguishes the heart, right, as an organ in the body, right? See, the eye doesn't have that function. The eye has a different function,
Mm-hmm.
right? Once you understand that purpose, then you can start to understand the heart, right? Does that make sense, right? So once you grasp the purpose of a thing, right,
Yeah.
grasp its function, then you can begin to really understand the what it is, really. So in a lot of cases, although we talked about definition first last time, really a lot of discovering the definition of a thing comes down to understanding the purpose of a thing that's embedded sort of within its very being.
And that's why in our language we can use things like analogies.
Mm,
I mean, if things didn't have purpose or meaning, we wouldn't be able to use anything analogously. I mean,
sure.
just take the example you were using there with the heart. I mean, we,
Right,
we
right.
speak about in classic spirituality, we speak about the heart. We wouldn't be able to use the heart as an analogy in that way if we didn't understand, again, like you said, the central function of the
Mm-hmm.
heart in the body. That without the
Right.
heart, there's no blood, there's no life, you die. Um, and so we speak about it in an analogous way. But if nothing had purpose or meaning, we wouldn't be able to. Our
Sure.
speech and language would be just very limited, and using analogies would just be stupid. It just
Right.
would
Yeah. Yeah.
it just wouldn't make any sense because we can define it or something like that. So the getting down to the nature of things has many different consequences,
Sure.
effects that
Mm-hmm.
we don't always realize. I mean, like
Mm-hmm.
that, for example, the use in language. It's important to
Sure.
understand the nature of the thing.
That's right. Yeah. And really, I mean, I think Plato had the insight here early on in classical philosophy. Aristotle, I think, gives it more precision, but
Mm-hmm.
had the insight to claim that, we see all things through the good, right? And that sounds very strange at first, right?
Right.
But then you sort of start playing out, like, what's the good of a thing? What's its purpose,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then you start to understand it, right? So the understanding, right, seeing, metaphorically taking, seeing is a result of comprehending purpose. Like
Mm-hmm.
once we get the idea that, oh, this thing is organized around a given purpose, then we can understand what it is. We can begin to define it.
Right.
If you think about even just the idea of order, right? Just
Mm-hmm.
just that term, order. Like what is an order, right? What's the difference between a pile of bricks in a house, right? I mean, one thing you could say is, like you could come over to my house and say, "Hey, Dr. Smith, that's a lovely pile of bricks you have there," and I would say, "Oh, well, thanks, I guess," but I usually call it a house,
Yeah.
right? Because it's not just a pile of bricks, and the reason it's not just a pile of bricks is because it has a different purpose, namely to shelter my family,
Right.
right? And its order, right, is a result of that purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense, right?
Yeah.
So the organization, the way the bricks are stacked on top of each other, the fact that we have walls that are upright, the fact that there's a roof, all of that sort of thing revolves around purpose, right? So in Aristotle's language, this comes down to what he calls the final cause.
Mm-hmm.
Some of this language, again, is a little difficult for us to think about. It sounds a little strange at first, but final here doesn't mean last in sequence.
Right.
The final cause can sometimes be last in sequence, but actually, in the causal order, the final cause for Aristotle is prior. In
Right.
fact, the final cause is prior to all of the other causes, right? Which is very important when you start to think about it. So the organization of my eye, the organization of my heart, the organization of my house, all of those things exist in the way that they do because of the purpose to which they are ordained.
Yeah. So if
Does
you
that
think
make
of
sense?
so if you think of it like you're going on a trip, you begin with the destination, and then you
That's
figure
right.
out how to get there. So you begin with,
Hmm.
I want a house. Okay, I have these bricks. Let's put them in order to build that house.
Sure.
So yeah, I think that's fairly easy to grasp. Even though it's called the final cause, it's first in the order of operation. It's
Yeah, it's first in order of intention, at least.
sorry, first in the order of
Yeah,
intention.
yeah. It might be last in accomplishment, but still, it still has this kind of causal priority. Now, I think this is really amusing because the example you use is very apropos about going on a trip or going on a journey, right? So often we hear this nonsense. People are like, "Well, on my spiritual journey, I'm da 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 da," whatever. When they start talking about their spiritual journey in this way, that's like, "Well, I'm just contradicting myself, but it's just part of my journey," right? And really, what they mean is, well, I'm just changing, right?
Right, right, right.
But they use the word journey, but in a way in which we would almost never use the word journey in most cases, right? Usually when we're on a journey, we have a destination
Yeah, it's more
and
of a
we can reach a
spiritual.
completion.
Yeah, it's more of a spiritual wondering. Like, right?
That's right. Yeah. It's called being lost.
Yeah, right. That. Yeah, my spirit. Yeah, my spiritual losing. Like.
My spiritual lostness.
Yeah.
I mean, like, if you were like, hey, Dr. Smith, I'm going to take the family to Florida. And I was like, oh, really? That's great. What route are you going to take? You're like, well, we're going to go through Kentucky, Iowa, Montana. And like, dude, like, you,
You,
you don't know where you're going, obviously.
well, maybe
And
maybe
here's the
that
thing is,
maybe that's a good question we should ask. When somebody says, they're talking about their spiritual journey, maybe that's a good first question. Where are you going?
that's right.
You
What's the
know?
destination? Because if you don't have a destination, then you're just wandering. Right?
Yeah, or it's some like kind of like vapid self-discovery.
Yeah, I am my destination. I mean, if somebody says that, you need to just be like, fare thee well.
Yeah.
Like, 'cause that's not a great
Yeah, and I mean
destination.
that's completely anti-Christian when Christ himself says, "I am the way, not you."
That's right. So I think I can illustrate this well if you just kind of think about again just sort of a physical example.
Hmm.
Uh, so you in a classical perspective, say the perspective of Aristotle or St. Thomas or Plato, um, the human eye has the structure that it has, right? It's super complex. It's a very interesting organ. I like those when you go into your doctor's office. I went for an eye exam a couple years back, and it was a nice doctor's office optometrist. Is that what you
Yeah,
say?
yeah.
Right? Right. And it had one of those big rubber models of the eyeball, but it was like big, it was like bigger than my head, right? And like it's one of the kinds you could take apart, you know.
Yeah,
So
cool.
yeah, it took a little bit for the doctor to get in there. So I was like, well, I'm gonna take this. I started taking this about halfway through, and he comes in, of course. But
He's like, "Put that
the
down. Stop
but here's
touching
the
it."
thing: it's like it's super complex. It's got all these different little parts, and if one part is just sort of misaligned, right? If one part doesn't fit with the other in just in exactly the right way,
Yeah.
then the eye doesn't function, right? And so the way Aristotle would have thought of this, and St. Thomas is, the eye has both the parts and the arrangement that it has. So those two things are important:
Hmm.
parts and arrangement. Um, we often aren't that detailed when we think about things, right? We think
Right.
about it's not just it. The composition of the parts is important, like the lens, right? But if the lens was in the back of the eye rather than on the front of the eye, you wouldn't see anything. Okay, right? So its placement, that is the arrangement of the parts, is also important, right? So as a mechanic, right? I mean, if you take the carburetor and you just kind of set it in the back seat and it's not connected to anything, I'd be like, "Hey, Jason, my car is working great. Oh, it should be working great. I got a carburetor. I understand what the problem is. Why isn't it turning on?" You say, "Well, is it connected?" No, but I got one. I mean, what? You telling me it matters where I put it? Yeah, it matters where you put it,
So demanding.
right? So demanding, right? So for Aristotle, the complexity of the eye, both its parts and its arrangement,
Hmm.
is due to the purpose of the eye. That
Right.
is, the purpose of seeing is causally prior to the the composition and arrangement of the eyeball, right?
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Hmm.
So it has all the parts that are needed and no extra parts, and it has them arranged properly for the purpose of seeing, right? And that's what I mean by saying causally prior. Now, let me contrast that with a more modern evolutionary perspective. In that perspective, the eyeball is sort of the necessary outcome of a combination of random mutation and random interaction with the broader environment.
Hmm.
So at some point, there were genetic mutations, according to the evolutionary story. There were some random mutations, right, that some of our ancestors experienced at the genetic level, in
Hmm.
which we developed eyes rather than not eyes. Okay. And um, obviously, having eyes is in most environments, not all, right, but in most environments, is more apt to facilitate survival,
Hmm.
right? So that's what I mean by the random interaction with the environment, right? Because like let's say that we see this with uh, The opposite with animals that are subterranean, right? Fish and some kinds of amphibians that their whole species exist underground, right?
Yeah.
Very often they just have vestigial eyes because they don't need them. Like eyes don't do anything, right, in terms of survival in that environment. And so the evolutionary story is, well, what happened is there was a random mutation, and the survivors are the ones that had experienced a random mutation that was most apt to survival.
Hmm.
So eyes are more apt to survival in most circumstances, and that's why most animals are eyed rather than non-eyed. Does
Hmm.
that make sense?
Yeah.
So in that case, it's just sort of a happy outcome for some species versus others, that they have things that just happen to be very apt to seeing, right? Um, it really needs to be put in that way. It just happens to be that the eyeball makes seeing happen. It's not designed. It's not for the purpose of. I remember I was re-listening to the podcast from last week, and you said something about things being, the purpose for which they were designed, and I thought, man, like contemporary philosophers, most evolutionists, they would just sort of dismiss that. Like, wait, design? There is no design in nature, right? There's just some things randomly happen, and then some things are more efficient than others. That's the story.
Yeah, I think it's difficult with that position though. Like you said, when you start to get into the details, not only do you have the parts, but you have the ordering of the parts. You have
Right.
the ordering of complex things like the eye. It's mind-boggling. I mean,
Right.
it's miraculous.
Sure. And
Um,
and I would say, that way of thinking, like where you try to exclude the idea of natural purpose, most philosophers who invoke this, right, have two agenda, right? One, to deny the existence of God, and two, to deny the existence of natural purpose because of the ethical implications of natural purpose. Um, but when you're not doing that, like when you're not just being sort of a secular atheist rebel against God,
yeah.
right? Then really this is just the natural way of human thinking, right? It's like if you go out in the woods, and I talk to my kids, so I like camping and fishing and all that sort of thing, right? When when you're in the outdoors, you naturally think this way, right? That is,
Hmm.
you naturally think about plants and animals having purposes, and this explains their behavior and their structure. Does
Right.
that make sense, right? Like you don't just say, well, I don't know why the fish swims that way. No, no. Right? Why did the bass happen to hang out near shady areas with you know
Roots or
uh,
sticks in the
yeah,
water or something.
roots and all that kind. Why do they hang out there? I don't know. They just happen to hang out there. No, because they want to ambush smaller fish. That's why.
Yeah. Tomorrow they could
There's
be
a
in the ocean.
purpose,
That's right.
right? And once you understand that, right, that helps you to be better at fishing for bass, right? Um, and all those sorts of things. So that's just a trivial example, but any of these sorts of things, right? That this is the natural human way of thinking. You really have to almost be, and we have been, I would say, indoctrinated
Yeah.
to stop thinking that there are natural purposes to things, right? If you were to ask, like, what's the purpose of the mouth? Well, to speak and to eat,
Yeah.
right? We understand the alignment of the teeth, the placement of the tongue, all those things in terms of um, the those functions, right? The functions we see in ourselves, but in other animals as well.
Yeah, in a fun little, you might want to try this to illustrate the point. If you have an atheist friend or something like that, the next time they have a birthday, give them a broken watch,
Mm,
and just say, okay, I bought you this nice watch. He'll look at you and say it's broken, and you'll be like, well, that doesn't really matter,
right.
because no, because but he'll say, well, no, the purpose of a watch is to tell time. This one does not tell time because it's broken,
Mhm.
therefore it's a bad watch. And
Right,
you're like,
right.
whoa, 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 we got to start over. There's so many like
Are you saying there's like design?
and purpose
Now, I think
and
I think what
ethical
the smart
implications.
atheist will say back to you is, well, yeah, that's an artifact, right? It's
Yeah.
like talking about a microphone. Well, yeah, we designed it for that purpose, but nature isn't designed, right? Um, and I think that's where you just have to sort of dig in your heels and say, no, nature acts for an end.
Yeah.
This is the one of the fundamental principles of classical ethics. Um, but even just sort of outside of that, just start trying to understand the world around us, right? We understand it by thinking about it in terms of purposes and ends, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Think about the end, and then we can understand the organization. We can understand the behavior. This is, and the thing that's so funny is the people who are most adamant sometimes about this, as soon as they get done saying Christians are stupid, they'll turn around and apply natural purposes to um, their field of inquiry, right?
Right.
So you think about, I for a long time as a kid, I was really interested in. There was a wonderful documentary about the wolves of Yellowstone National Park that I watched quite a few times, and the naturalist who was sort of taking the lead on this, followed this pack. So this was actually what was so interesting about it through about 3 seasons, I want to say,
Oh,
three
wow.
years. So you actually got a sense of, oh, like I kind of understand because like if you don't do that right, then you're just sort of like wolves occasionally show up and eat stuff,
Yeah.
right, and then they go
Randomly
away,
attack people.
right, yeah, right. But actually, wolves live really fascinating lives once you sort of follow them for a period of years. But it's not sort of like, I mean, what this naturalist was never sort of like, well, I don't know why the hell they're doing that, right?
Yeah.
No, right? Like every behavior after observing it, right? He could say, oh, the purpose for this behavior, this is why these particular wolves are fighting each other,
Mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm.
For the purpose of establishing a breeding order. This is why wolves hunt in the almost like a formation, almost like a tactical strategy, right?
Yeah.
That they do. This is why wolves go after old and very young elk. Is it because they're mean?
Yeah.
Wolves are mean. That's why they go after the young. No, okay, because they want to eat as efficiently as possible. It's easier to kill the young and the old and eat them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think that's one thing that, even that, like, the because that narrative is kind of played out so much today,
Right.
that many good Christians, and like you said, we operate our day-to-day lives
Uh,
based on a real philosophy of
sure.
metaphysics and purpose and meaning and all these things,
Yeah,
uh,
as soon as we shut up about uh, you know, trying to justify I don't know our sexual decadence or whatever it may be, then we start to recognize like, oh yeah, we go back to the natural way of talking. Imagine if your doctor was sort of like, heck, I don't know what the kidney's for, right? Like, it's just like I got to get out of here, right? Because I want my doctor to believe in natural purposes, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But I think there's a lot of good Christians out there who struggle with understanding religion and the things of God connected
Sure.
to this kind of natural philosophy or this kind of metaphysical understanding of the world. How do we get back to that? How do
Yeah.
we understand the things of God within this kind of nature, purpose, meaning,
Sure.
kind of framework? I guess, if that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the things you want to say is that nature acts for an end. So, that it's not as if God arbitrarily or extrinsically imposes order on the natural world. Rather,
Mm-hmm.
the natural world is embedded with the purposes that God gave it, right?
Mm.
So, one of the ways, like you don't want to say like God imposes seeing on the eye. Rather, God intended for man to see, and therefore he designed the eye.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right? That's the way you want to think about it, right? So that from basing yourself on the fifth way, that is Thomas Aquinas's fifth argument for the existence of God. He goes from the premise that there is order and that there are natural ends to the conclusion that there must be a universal mind that governs and directs these things towards ends.
Mm-hmm.
So what you want to say is that nature acts for an end. Unintelligent things have purposes, which sounds weird at first to think about.
Yeah.
It's not as if the tree is thinking my purpose is to perpetuate I don't know, oak tree life, right? Or the badger is thinking about, well, I'm going to perpetuate badger life. But they do actually act for an end without knowing that they are doing so, right? Unintelligent things, because God has designed them with a purpose. In the way that this microphone that I'm speaking into was designed, right? It doesn't think, oh, my purpose is to
Yeah.
take in sound waves or amplify them or whatever. But um, but but it does have that end, and it effectively does its operations because it was designed for that end. Similar with the badger. The badger isn't thinking, well, my job is to perpetuate badger life, right? But it in fact is designed to that end. So then the question is, well, on the from the fact that we can observe that badgers are oriented towards an end and that trees are oriented towards an end and all those sort of things, we can infer that they must come from an intelligent source, right? That is, that there was some intelligence, from which all of these things came, in order for them to have the design that they do. Now, in terms of arguing for this, two things. There's a couple of different paths you can take here.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of them is just kind of an inductive path. Some people don't like that, and some philosophers don't like that. But if you go through example after example after example, eventually you show like things are just more understandable. They make more sense when you think about it this way. That is, that there are natural purposes. I think that's actually when it really comes down to being persuaded by something, right? I think that even though inductive reasoning doesn't give you that sort of knockdown conclusion that some people really want, I actually think that's more persuasive, right? When you watch example after example after example, you say, you know what?
Yeah,
the hypothesis of natural design just makes more sense than its opposite.
Yeah, the evidence for it is just completely overwhelming, and the evidence of the contrary is just it's sorely lacking.
The other way of doing this that's useful is what's called reductio ad absurdum, right? That's
Mm-hmm.
the word. That is, it's a form of deductive reasoning where you take a hypothesis, right, that's the opposite of your view, and you reduce it to the absurd. You show that there's some sort of contradiction or some sort of self-defeating character to a hypothesis. So the most obvious example of this, maybe it's not the most obvious, but very obvious, is is that the claim that all truths are relative, or that there are no absolute truths, right?
Right.
Is obviously false because it contradicts itself. That is, if it's true, then it can't be true that there are no absolute truths, right?
Right.
That's a classic example of reductio ad absurdum. For some strange reason, this doesn't prevent people from being relativists, right? Even though their position is like, day 2 of logic class. Like, well, this is an example of really idiotic thinking, right? And I don't know. Anyways, God bless us. But anyways, so that's a good way of, I think, of defeating many errors, modern errors, is to show that they lead to, that is, they reduce to some sort of contradiction or some sort of self-defeating kind of characteristic. And so I think the denial of natural purpose is sort of like that, right? You end up having to posit things like that, that the greater comes from the lesser, that the ordered comes from the disordered, right? That just we have this sort of spontaneous order, and you're sort of like, well, why isn't you're just, eventually at some point Bertrand Russell just says, shut up, right? Like, stop asking why it is. This is the way it is, and then we can start to reason. Like, okay, fine. I get the point, but that doesn't really answer the question, right?
Yeah.
So that if you hold for kind of an extreme version of evolution, right, of randomness, right, then you really say order comes from disorder, and that's metaphysically absurd.
Yeah.
Okay, those are complementary categories, complementary meaning in the technical sense, that they're opposites that divide the world, right? So the same thing cannot be ordered and disordered at the same time in the same respect, right? It violates the law of non-contradiction. If you violate that principle, all reasoning, including math and science, go out the window. And so, to say that the ordered comes from the disordered is metaphysically absurd. Maybe even more strongly, right? You can develop a reductio ad absurdum argument against sort of extreme randomness on the basis of kind of the epistemological side. That is, if reason isn't ordered to an end, right? That is, if reason isn't designed for and ordered to truth and knowledge and science, then we have no good reason, no non-question begging reason to believe that reason is reliable, even in its scientific and mathematical functions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and that is quite absurd.
That's right.
Going back to kind of just the original question about looking at purpose. The
Hmm.
purpose of our reasoning and the purpose of our
Sure.
thinking and reasoning is ordered towards truth. And it's
Right.
order, I mean, the fact that science books can exist
Right.
show that there's not only a great amount of reasoning on the part, I mean, a great amount of ordering and reasoning, because where you have order, you'll have reasoning on the part of the natural world and the things in it, but also on the part of the person writing or the person reading the science book, that we
Mhm.
can that they can make sense of it. So I mean, it even seems odd for even the person to be reasoning towards this kind
Sure.
of thing. Or maybe you
Right.
could talk a little bit more, about what happens if we don't believe in the purpose of our own reasoning. Does it
Right.
have
Sure.
any meaning? Does it? What is it? What do we do with that?
Yeah, you could just say, look, I mean, so a philosopher who talks about this and does a good job is it's not a Catholic philosopher, but a Protestant philosopher who's very good, a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga. But he says, look, it just could be the case, right, that reason is something that is survival apt and non-veridical. That is something that just developed, but has no it was sort of a random mutation, the result of random mutations, but it's not designed for truth. It's just actually really helpful for survival, right? Now, of course, he doesn't believe that.
Right.
And so he wants to say is, if you hold that view, so he calls it naturalistic evolution, right?
Mm-hmm.
So naturalistic evolutionary theory wants to exclude all design and God, of course, from the evolutionary story. And so the what he wants to say is like there's no that all of the science that sort of supposedly supports the evolutionary story, all of that science, you can't trust it.
Yeah.
Not because he's being some sort of like religious fanatic, but just because if you hold that it's just a kind of arbitrary random mutation that we have reason, then you have no reason to assume. You have, again, no reason to assume that or infer that reason or our cognitive apparatus is in fact reliable. But you could say, well, look at all these times I can show you all these times where it worked out. So like we flew to the moon, we can predict weather, we can cure all these different diseases. But all that assumes that your cognitive apparatus is correct. You're citing things as evidence, presupposes that your cognitive apparatus is truth apt,
Yeah.
right? That it is ordered towards the truth. But if you deny from the outset that reason is ordered to truth, right? That reason has as its natural end truth, then you have no good grounds for assuming that science or math or any other deliverance of reason is in fact reliable.
We understand that when it comes to things like math, science, reading, but when it comes to like the human person,
Sure.
or religion or something, we're so. Now, is it just the result of the fall? One of the results of the fall? I mean, is it just us in our prideful wills? I mean, or what is it? What is it that's there that when it comes to the human person, we're afraid to make the same conclusions that, some people will die for when it comes to
Sure.
science and scientific truth and mathematical truth and all these things?
Right. I would say pride, greed, and sex. I mean,
The big three.
like,
The big three.
I mean, like, it really comes down to it. I mean, when I was teaching ethics at a Catholic college, I would have I'd have a couple of weeks that I called murder, sex, and money, and those were the most exciting weeks in the course, right? And this is where I would get into the nitty gritty of applying ethics to concrete particular kinds of actions.
Mm-hmm.
And so we talked about murder, sex, and money. And so your violence, all right, violent actions, sexual actions, and then it really interesting economic action, right?
Yeah.
Money, right? And it was really interesting. Like the students got as animated about the use of money and the pursuit of money, right, as they did sex, right?
Mm.
Which I thought was really interesting. Like, in a sense, I could kind of see the connection, reflecting back on it. But I didn't anticipate it, right,
Yeah.
at the time, right. And so you think, like, what is the purpose of? Is there a purpose to human ownership, right? Is private property something, and owning things, right? Is that just an arbitrary human invention, or does property, the use of material things, have some end? And in fact, it does have an end. And if you want more of it, that this is, this is not a very American thing to say, but if you want more, so much of it that it exceeds the natural purpose, then that's actually in fact vicious, right? It's a vice, and it's called greed, right? You shouldn't want much more than what you need for today and tomorrow, according to your circumstances of life and decency. Um, so that maybe we can do a podcast about greed, but forget that, man. I
Yeah.
want a bass boat. I want to live by myself in a 3,000 square foot house. I want to
No.
have
I
5 acres of
need a
property.
bass boat. I
That's
need a
right. I
bass
need a bass boat
boat.
and the Suburban, right? Or whatever. So I need all those things, right? No, no, no.
Yeah.
Right? That's greed. That's conspicuous consumption, and it's vicious, right? But we don't like that. See, like I want the this thing, right? I want the second SUV.
Hmm.
I want the 3,000 square foot house that I don't need. I want that blah blah blah. I want. And so I think when it comes down to it, it's right, you were quite right to kind of see it was rooted in pride. When pride ultimately drives us to think of ourselves as the end of everything,
Hmm.
we make ourselves the ultimate end of everything around us. In that sense, right, it literally is idolatrous, right? Because we place ourselves in the position of God, who is the ultimate end of all things. The prideful person, and all of us have some pride, right? We subordinate everything else to ourselves as if we, in our very substance, were the ultimate end. And so, a woman doesn't exist for God, right? She exists for my pleasure, right?
Right.
Material things don't exist for supporting human life. They exist in order to make me have just the right backsplash, so I feel wonderful about my kitchen, right? I mean, all those sorts of things, right? Where you about vanity and about all that, right? So it becomes, instead of them having their own natural ends,
Hmm.
right? Those things come to have yourself, right,
Right.
as their end. Right? And so what you can do then is you can live however you want. You can, sort of be the god of your own universe. So I think, in large measure, and of course, I've sort of avoided on purpose just reducing it to talking about sexual ethics, but where this is most obvious, right, is in
Hmm.
the area of sexual ethics, where every society, every sane society for almost all of human history has recognized that sex is pleasurable, duh, right? But that have seen that the natural end of sex, right, is union and irreducibly
Yeah.
procreation, right? Having babies. Even somebody as decadent as Sigmund Freud, right, said, right, that the further sex moves from that procreative function,
Hmm.
right, the more and more it needs to be recognized as neurotic, right? And that's Sigmund
Yeah.
Freud, right? Who's like hardly any kind of conservative, right? But he recognized, look, that that sane, healthy sex is tied to one degree or the other. I'm just going to be loose here on it, but to one degree or the other is tied to procreation. And the further sex goes from being tied to that natural end,
Hmm.
the more it participates in neurosis.
We understand, things can have many different meanings and many different purposes. But to begin with those natural ends, those, like you were talking about with sex, the unitive and procreative aspects of them. And we do this with, I mean, again, almost everything in the natural world. We begin with what are those natural ends. Okay, once we have those established, then we can look for further meaning, further implications, things like
Right.
that. It's kind of like scripture. You begin with the literal sense, and then all
Mhm.
other senses of scripture come after that. When we're trying to understand things, particularly on a ethical level, we have to begin with those kind of natural ends. What is the purpose of this thing?
Mhm.
And doesn't if something neglects one of those ends, if something, we would say it's, like we go back to the clock example. The
Mhm.
purpose of a clock is to tell time. If it doesn't tell time, it's a bad clock. And so
Wait a
if
second, Jason.
yeah,
Jason, wait a second. Are you suggesting that there are bad people?
no, I don't want to be divisive because that's the highest virtue we have. Well, and that was my next point is many times today, there's I think it was Cardinal Robert Serra. He's got a book on silence that's good.
Oh,
And I think it's
fantastic book.
I,
Fantastic book. I love
I
it.
think it's in that book. I could be wrong. Or I remember reading recently about the idol of community, and we could do a whole podcast on this. But when the community becomes an idol, we hold up things like not being divisive
Mm,
above being what is true. Like we would
right, right.
rather
Yeah,
we don't want to do anything to divide the community, even if it
sure.
may be something that is true. So I mean, I think
Right.
again, when we begin with understanding those natural ends, natural purposes, that's where we're going to find fulfillment. Because again, this goes back to not only the design for the world, but the design for us to interact with the world. But also, it can, if we begin with these things, it can kind of ward off those other things that may try to creep into our lives and lead us away from God, lead us away from what is true. Because I mean, like today, I mean, being divisive is like one of the most horrible things a human person can do.
Yeah, you're of course right, Jason, rhetorically, and socially, but that only cuts one way. I mean, if you're being divisive by saying Catholics are backwards,
Oh, right, right, yeah.
men are
Well, see,
evil
that's true,
intrinsically,
right? Yeah.
then that's okay. It's okay to be divisive that way, right? So it actually only goes in one direction here. But you're right that very often is used, right? This goes towards just sort of really the foundation of classical ethical thinking, right?
Mm-hmm.
I would say just common sense ethical thinking, which recognizes that there are natural purposes. uh, I wear glasses not because they decorate my face nicely, but because I have bad eyes,
Yeah.
right? Right. They're not morally bad, as in they're not voluntarily bad, but they're bad eyes because I can't see well without my glasses, right? Everything is fuzzy, and so it makes sense. If I said, "Oh, I've got bad eyes," you wouldn't look at me like, what are you talking about? You got that much. Right?
They do look
You
bad.
understand what I mean, right? Like,
Yeah.
oh, you can't see well. That's why you wear glasses. Okay, I
Right,
get it.
because they do not fulfill the purpose they were designed for.
That's right, exactly. And human action is like that, though.
Yeah.
That's morality is completely objective, because there are objective purposes, natural purposes to which the human person is connected. When you act in a way that doesn't fit with those natural purposes,
Mm-hmm.
like if you voluntarily eat glass, right, then right, that's not just unhealthy, it's vicious,
Right.
right, because it's contrary to the natural end of eating and of your digestive system. And this will be borne out very quickly if you eat glass, right? That it's contrary to its natural purpose. um, so those kinds of things, right, where you can see that there are natural purposes to things, allows us to evaluate voluntary human action as either good or bad from an objective framework, and therefore also, and this even if people who agree with that will sometimes then slam the brakes, as we would say, and evaluate agents, right? That is that there are there are bad agents,
Yeah.
right? That is, there are human beings who are bad because why? Because they do bad things,
Right.
right, on a consistent basis. Now, here's the other side of this: is we're all bad, okay, and that's why we need the gospel, right?
Right.
We need the gospel. We need our Lord. We need grace, because the truth about us, right, is that while not all of us are as bad as we could be, right, some of us are worse than others.
Words of
We
hope.
all fit in the category of bad, except
Yeah.
for Our Lady and Jesus Christ.
All right. Well, Dr. Smith, thank you very much for that. That message of hope there. We are all bad, but but the gospel message is there. And I think it's important for all of us to remember that whenever we're looking at or talking to people about these kinds of things, to base what we're talking about in reality, whether it's truth, beauty, goodness, we base it in reality, and in the reality and the nature of things, we can find meaning, we can find purpose. If we understand the purpose, then we can understand the meaning. And it's from there that we need to have conversations about what is true, or we need to have those conversations about why the church teaches what she does teach. From those kind of natural beginnings, natural things, it does a great job, I think, from a theological perspective, to begin when you begin with a philosophical foundation like this. It brings together not only somebody's understanding, but it brings their reasoning in, and they can say, "Oh, they may say, I disagree with you, but hopefully they can at least say that seems reasonable. Because a lot of times that's a first step to understanding what the church teaches, which then should hopefully lead to somebody believing what the church teaches. And so I want to invite all of our listeners to check out all of our content over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. Until next time, God bless.